everyone. Welcome back to the Murder Tapes podcast, episode 2. I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much for all of the love and support you guys have sent me since I released episode 1. It has been such an amazing experience, and if you know me, then you know that starting a true crime podcast has always been a dream of mine, and so I'm really just happy that there are people willing to listen to me, present evidence, analyze cases, and just go over things that I find interesting. So into today's case, it is easily one of the scariest cases I've ever read through, and as always, all evidence will be available for you in the show notes. Today we're going to be discussing the Wichita Massacre. On December 7th, 2000, in Wichita, Kansas, the Carr brothers, Reginald Dexter Carr Jr. and Jonathan D. Carr, robbed 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber after he left a convenience store. One of the brothers approached him, held him at gunpoint, and ordered that he drive to an ATM in order to withdraw money. Once they arrived, they demanded that he withdraw $800. He was hit in the head with a gun multiple times, but luckily was not killed. Andrew's bank didn't allow him to take out any more money as he was at the set limit for the day. They then drove him to a nearby car wash where they cleaned the car in order to erase any DNA evidence that may have remained. They then decided to drive back to the convenience store they originally kidnapped him from in order to pick up one of the gunman's vehicles. The victim was still in the back of the SUV when both cars drove to a secluded area and the two brothers began to have a conversation on what to do next. One of the suggestions was to leave the victim there without clothes in the cold weather. After one of the brothers shot out the tires, they threw the keys onto the road and left. After they drove away, Andrew made sure they were gone before grabbing the keys and luckily being able to start his car. He then drove home and told 911 what had happened. Their next crime took place on December 11th at 9:45 p.m. 55-year-old Ann Walenta, who was a cellist and librarian, had just arrived home when she noticed that she had been followed. Upon seeing the van behind her, she decided to wait while parked in her driveway and see if they would leave. A man began towards her and made it seem like he was in need. She decided to then roll down her window in order to see what he needed. When she did, however, he took out a gun. Her first reaction was to reverse her car. Unfortunately, the shooter then shot through her windshield a total of 7 times. Some of the bullets struck her and one hit her spine, severing it. The car then drove off, and shortly after one of her neighbors came outside after hearing the commotion, Anne called out for help and was taken to a nearby hospital. She was able to give a description of the two brothers before she died just 1 month later due to a pulmonary embolism due to the gunshot to her spine. A pulmonary embolism is a blockage that occurs when a blood clot gets stuck in your lungs. Just 3 days later, on December 14th, 2000, at 10:45 p.m., Jan Beck was driving home when she noticed she too was being followed. She decided to call her daughter and ask her to open the garage door. After doing so, she also decided to stay in her car until she saw the people following her go in another direction. The vehicle then drove past her, but eventually circled back. She lived in a triplex, so when they arrived back, they decided to head to the 3rd unit in hopes of finding her. They stopped at a middle unit, but this was not hers, and when they knocked on the door, they were met with someone else. It was 29-year-old Aaron Sander, who was also one of the 4 roommates that lived in this unit. They got angry when they realized that this wasn't the right unit, but decided to stay because they needed money. One of the brothers then grabbed Aaron and also held him at gunpoint. They then forced him into one of the bedrooms that happened to belong to another roommate, 26-year-old Jason Beffert, who was in his bed with his girlfriend HG. And before we continue on with the case, I just want to quickly circle back to Jan Beck because this situation reminded me of me and my mom. We always call each other, especially when we're on our way home, just to make sure that we're both safe. And so I just feel really happy that these 2 people were able to escape these 2 evil men, but it is very sad what happens to everyone else. And I'm sure after reading about what happened, they were truly horrified and still are very horrified about the situation. So just a constant reminder to always check in on your mom, your dad, your siblings, your significant other. Just make sure that everyone close to you gets home safe. So back to where we were in the case, we left off on the part where one of the brothers had grabbed Aaron and gone into the other roommate's room when he was in bed with his girlfriend, HG. So after this, the brothers were becoming more irritated and asked how many people lived there. They told them that 27-year-old Brad Haka was downstairs and one of their other friends, 25-year-old Heather Muller, was asleep upstairs. The brothers then forced everyone into one room and forced them all to remove their clothes and get into the bedroom closet. This is when the horror began. They demanded the two women, 25-year-old Heather and HG, the girlfriend of Jason Beffert, to get out of the closet and engage in sexual activity with each other. And this is another part of the case that really got to me because it's just so sad to think about how scared they must have been and how the victims' friends felt because they were in a closet right next to everything happening, especially Jason, the boyfriend of HG, hearing this but not being able to do anything. The brothers then brought out the rest of the victims and told each man that they were to rape the two girls individually. One of the guys began to cry and said that he couldn't do it. After that, one of the brothers grabbed a golf club and struck him on his head. Unfortunately, after being struck, he was still forced to rape the girls. The brothers then resorted to their previous idea and decided to take Brad's truck and each victim, one by one, to an ATM in order to withdraw money. Unfortunately, this didn't stop the attacks, because while one victim was gone, the others were still being tortured. They put each victim back into the closet, and then Jonathan demanded HG to come out and raped her multiple times. He then decided to do the same to Heather. As I mentioned previously, all of the other victims could hear these things happening while in the closet. Jonathan then decided to search the house for valuables when he came across a wedding ring. This wedding ring was hidden, and he was determined to find out whose it was. It was discovered that Jason Beffert was planning on proposing to HG, and at this moment, that plan was revealed. Jason was planning on asking her to be his wife the day of Christmas. And this really speaks to Jonathan's character because he knew that it was a wedding ring. He knew that it was hidden for a reason, and he most definitely felt pleasure in outing the secret that someone was going to be proposed to. He insisted on finding out who it was, when he was going to propose, and then threw it in their face. So it's a really unfortunate situation. I couldn't imagine being put in this situation in general, but to have my proposal outed and not know if I'll be able to live past this is just so heartbreaking and so unfortunate. After all of the money from each victim's bank account was taken out, Reginald returned with the truck and also decided to rape both HG and Heather. This horror went on until midnight. The brothers decided it was time to move on with their plan. The victims were still unclothed and were demanded to go outside in the cold. The men were separated and taken into a separate car. They were all put into the trunk of one of the victims' cars, and Heather was put in the passenger seat. HG was taken into Brad's truck, just like before when they took them to the ATM. All victims were then taken to a soccer field that they knew people wouldn't be by because it was undergoing construction. They then placed both Heather and HG into one vehicle so that the two brothers could talk for a little bit about their plan. After discussing their plan, they eventually gathered all victims near the truck and demanded that they kneel. Upon doing so, they shot each victim executioner style. Everyone died except HG, which you're probably wondering, how did she survive a shot to the head? Luckily, just a little while before the brothers invaded the unit, she had put in a hair clip, and this hair clip saved her life because it deflected the bullet. Aside from how sad this case is, this is just such a wonderful part of the story because I wear claw clips all the time, and this is just such a small detail that you wouldn't expect, that a killer wouldn't expect when hurting someone. And so it really is just one of those things where it's like, wow, the universe is an amazing thing. And she was meant to survive to tell this story and to get these people justice, her friends justice, her boyfriend justice. But anyways, moving on. She was definitely still harmed because she did get shot. She couldn't see all that well, but she decided to act like she was dead. She would later testify that she remembered the sound of the vehicle doors shutting, and when the car started, she felt it roll over her and her friends. Could you even imagine being shot in the head, seeing all your other friends being shot in the head, and then being run over, and still managing to gather the courage to get up and help your friends? She waited for the sound of the vehicle to disappear and then decided to get up and check on her boyfriend in hopes that he was still alive. She grabbed a piece of clothing and put it around his head in order to protect it, and then went to check on her other friends, but they were unfortunately clearly dead. This is when she realized that she needed to get help before it was too late. She tried her best to get up and go towards the lights that she saw. She was still naked in the freezing weather, but she was able to contact police and state what the two brothers looked like and where to find her friends. When police arrived on the scene, they were met with a horrific image. All of the victims were dead, and they began searching for the two brothers. Luckily, Reginald Carr was quickly found and arrested because one of the neighbors was watching the news and saw the truck description and decided to call it in. While they searched the vehicle, they found lots of the victim's belongings. Police were still on the hunt for Jonathan. He was currently at his girlfriend's house, and the news mentioned that his brother had just been arrested. The girlfriend's mother recognized him on TV and grew concerned. She decided to leave her home and contact the police. He was then arrested, and HG's engagement ring was found, which is such a fucked up thing to do. Like, excuse my language, but to steal an engagement ring after murdering these two people is just so heartless, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but for now. After he too was arrested, both of their mugshots were displayed on the news. Their very first victim, Andrew, recognized them and called the police to inform them that these were the two brothers that had kidnapped him. Like most murderers, the Carr brothers had a horrible childhood, and before we get into their childhood, I just want to quickly say that just because someone has a horrible childhood does not necessarily mean that they're going to go off and murder people or be extremely violent. There are plenty of people that had horrible childhoods, got beat, got raped, bullied, etc., and they came out perfectly fine. They're in relationships, they're living their normal lives. There are also just some people that feed off of negativity and feed off of harming others, and I think that is a part of this case because while they did have a horrible childhood, they also did know what they were doing. So when they were younger, one of their younger sisters had died from leukemia, and their parents decided to begin drinking heavily. This led to more arguments, more disagreements, and that eventually led them to divorce. Both of their parents didn't care to be around either of the brothers or the sisters during this point, and Reginald began taking care of his siblings. This led him and his brother to grow closer, but it also allowed for them to act carelessly and do whatever they wanted because they didn't have any parental supervision. They began drinking alcohol in elementary school. Yes, I said elementary school, not high school, not college, elementary. When we are in our early stages of development, our brains are very sensitive to drugs, alcohol, and most importantly, our surroundings. Alcohol slows down development when consumed at an early age. Aside from the abuse of alcohol, Reginald also began engaging in sexual activity when he was just 6 years old, with girls his mom was babysitting at the time. This wasn't the only occasion that he engaged in this behavior, as he mentioned that he also frequently had sex with one of his cousins at the age of 7. Something that I found to be even more disturbing was that he had found explicit photos of both his mother and stepfather when he was a child, and continued to keep them throughout his life. In fact, they were obtained when he was arrested for his crimes. So what does this mean? It could mean multiple things, but what I'm assuming is that he either felt comforted by these photos, aroused by these photos. Either way, he needed them around him at all times. He developed ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder, when he was just 5 years old. Antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder that causes people to act impulsively, lie, lack empathy, and not care about the safety of others. Jonathan also began engaging in sexual acts at a young age. When he was just 6 years old, his brother told him he needed to have sex with a girl, and anytime he refused to, he would make fun of him. It's important to note that Jonathan often went along with what his brother asked as a child because he looked up to his older brother. I think anyone with an older sibling, or just siblings in general, can argue that when you were younger, you cared about what your siblings thought of you, and you tried to do things to make them proud of you, notice you, etc. So this is a great example of that. And in this case in particular, we also see that this is a continued pattern in their adult lives. And so you're probably wondering, why is it so damaging to engage in sexual acts at such a young age? Well, it's damaging because when our bodies aren't able to grow at their own rate, it can throw off everything. The most notable changes is the structure of the hippocampus, the part of our brain that is responsible for both memory and learning. This can also lead to people having abnormal sexual fantasies as adults, so they find pleasure in harming someone, they aren't able to feel aroused unless someone is dead, etc. So we see that in a lot of cases of murder, but this one in particular is a great example because these two brothers are forcing people to rape other people, they're raping the person, killing them, and they find it amusing. Their other sister testified in court that she was raped by her father when she was younger, and that her and her brothers were molested by their mother's many boyfriends. The children were actually vocal about these encounters, but their mother never took action to protect them. In fact, anytime the children got in trouble, Her way of punishing them was to get all of the siblings together and have them undress the one in trouble. She would then beat the child while they were naked, which is very similar to how they treated their victims. On September 5th, 2002, the trial began, and HG was finally able to share her story. 50 pieces of evidence were presented, and eventually, the brothers actually decided to go against each other. Reginald would be taken out of court multiple times for being seen smiling and blowing kisses at those testifying against him. They even had to eventually shackle both his hands and feet after he rubbed against the female prosecuting attorney. On November 5th, 2002, 14 hours after deliberation, both brothers were found guilty and convicted of 130 counts. These counts included kidnapping, robbery, rape, 4 counts of capital murder, and 1 count of first-degree murder. They were both sentenced to death and life in prison. They had no reaction after being convicted, but their lawyers appealed, and the Kansas Supreme Court vacated the death penalty in both cases, because the instructions used in the sentencing violated the Constitution. In particular, they felt that the 8th Amendment was violated because they deserved separate sentencing trials. However, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalties and combined sentencing, as it did not violate the Constitution. I'll also add in some audio of that as well.
A Kansas jury sentenced the Carrs to death for the murders of the 4 slain victims. The Kansas Supreme Court vacated all of these death sentences. The court held that the mitigating circumstance instruction used in both Gleason's and the Carrs' sentencing violated the 8th Amendment. The court concluded that jurors might have excluded some mitigating circumstances from their consideration because the instructions failed to state expressly that mitigating factors need not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. With respect to the Carrs' death sentences, the Kansas Supreme Court also held that conducting a joint sentencing proceeding rather than a separate proceeding for each defendant violated the 8th Amendment. According to the court, the joint proceeding prevented the jury's individualized consideration of each defendant because evidence of mitigating circumstances produced by one brother prejudiced the other, and vice versa. We reverse. We hold that the Constitution does not require capital sentencing courts to instruct the jury that mitigating circumstances need not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Nor was there anything unique about these cases that would require such an instruction to avoid confusion. Even if we were to assume that it would be unconstitutional to require the defense to prove mitigating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt, there is no likelihood that the juries would have misconstrued the instructions to impose that burden of proof here. The instructions distinguished between aggravating circumstances, which they said the state had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and mitigating circumstances, which the instruction said need only be found to exist by the jury. Jurors were told to consider any mitigating circumstance, even those not found to exist by other members of the jury. Jurors would not have misunderstood these instructions to prevent their consideration of constitutionally relevant evidence. We also hold that jointly sentencing the Carrs did not violate the Constitution.
I'm really happy that I was able to find that audio for you guys. It will be linked in the show notes under court documents and audio, and there you can finish listening to all of the arguments. You can read all about the case, etc. But aside from that, something that is very heartfelt is that HG and Andrew, the first victim in the case, became very close when they were testifying in court and actually got married in 2004 after 2 years of dating, and they had 2 children. So I'd like to quickly highlight the amazing things that these victims were also doing with their lives before they were horrifically murdered. 27-year-old Brad Haka was the director of a finance company. 25-year-old Heather Muller was a preschool teacher. 29-year-old Aaron Sander was studying to become a priest. And 26-year-old Jason Beffert was a local high school teacher. I really hope that their families feel that they got some sense of justice, though they won't get their family members back. This whole situation is very horrifying and just so sad. Every time I would see it or see updates and read about it, I just always had a pit in my stomach that just felt very strange. And even now, covering the case, it feels so sad to say these things out loud. And you would assume that it would be easy after, reading through so many cases, but it really doesn't get easier. And each time you hear stuff like this, it just always hurts your heart. And you just think about your own friends, your own family, and how anyone could do something like this. And with that, that is the end of this case. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 2. I am so thankful for every single one of you that has saved the show, subscribed to the show. I really, really appreciate it. If you enjoy the show and would like to help out, you can always leave a rating or review, save the show, and interact with our Instagram. It is at Murder Tapes Podcast, and my personal Instagram is at Annalisa. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next one.